which has been making headlines across many of today's front pages. A man found guilty of raping a 13-year-old girl was spared prison and given a community sentence instead. Sean Hogg, who's 21, was given the Community Payback Order, which came after the introduction of new sentencing guidelines for under-25s last year at Glasgow Sheriff Court when he was sentenced yesterday. Let's speak to Thomas Ross Casey, leading criminal defence lawyer. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Gary.
Tell us a little bit about these new guidelines, first of all.
Well, the logic behind the new guidelines, which have actually now been current for about 15 months or 14 months, is that the brain doesn't fully develop until the age of around about 26. And therefore, for that reason, that when sentencing has been imposed in relation to an offender who's under the age of 25, then different considerations apply. That's a very quick summary of what's quite a complicated guideline.
Yeah, he was 17 when the crime was committed, 21 now, and in sentencing it was decided that this would be better for his rehabilitation ultimately, and was applying these guidelines.
Yeah, and the guideline says that in the case of a young person, then rehabilitation is a primary consideration. And I would imagine that was at the forefront of the judge's mind. I mean, I should say that many young people are sentenced, and most young people who are sentenced for rape go to prison. So this is quite an unusual sentence.
Yeah, and then just on the prison issue first, for the moment, is rehabilitation possible in prison? Because it seems that in passing the sentence, the judge felt that that wasn't going to happen in this case.
Well, I mean, I think the evidence. Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence would suggest the contrary. Obviously, there are fairly high rates of reoffending, and it's reasonably predictable that if you put a young person in amongst a group of 100 other young people, all of whom have problems and have offended, then it could have negative consequences. But of course, the public are right to point out that the interests of the individual who is being sentenced are not the only interests which have to be considered by the court.
Well, indeed, and Rape Crisis says that this feels like an incredible situation. Someone who raped a young girl walks away with a community payback order. They're also concerned about the effect that this might have in the message it sends to anyone thinking of reporting rape and how the justice system treats rape. Would you share those concerns?
It's a very valid point. I heard Sandy on the radio last night and I understood everything she said. But what I would say is it's an extraordinary sentence. I've been working in the High Court now for around 20-odd years. I've never seen anybody avoid prison for rape until yesterday.
What potentially happens now, because the Crown has indicated is looking at the sentence, it may appeal. How does that process work?
Well, it's really very simple. The Crown would lodge a document in which they would set out the grounds of appeal, and I suppose the grounds would be fairly simple, that when the case is so serious, then a custodial sentence is called for, and that the judge should have dealt with the case by imposing a custodial sentence. I think he said, had it been an adult, a sentence of 4 or 5 years would have been imposed, and then applying a suitable discount to reflect the age of the offender. And then there would be a hearing in the High Court at which the Crown would be able to argue, and the accused representatives would be able to argue against the appeal. They haven't said that they will appeal, but they did have an appeal in December where the whole question of sentences for rape was considered in a domestic context. And clearly it gave an indication that Crown Office thought that sentences for rape were too low, so that this plays right into that argument.
And is that hearing in front of another judge? Does the judge in this case get a chance to explain his thinking?
Exactly, that's the starting process. So the Crown would lodge the document. Lord Lake would prepare a note in which he would explain the reasons for the sentence which he imposed, which would be given to both sides and to the 3 judges who would consider the appeal. And then it would be argued in front of the judges. And it doesn't take very long these days. The procedures have been simplified. And if there was to be an appeal, it's realistic to think that could happen by the summer.
And as regards these new sentencing guidelines, They are controversial, clearly, because of the situation we find ourselves in with this particular case. Would you imagine that they may be looked at again?
It's really quite a new concept in Scotland. You know, this is something that England and Wales have been running with for a number of years, whereas we really depended on judges essentially following the lead of other judges in terms of sentence. And the sentencing guidelines is quite a new concept. And to some extent, we're all still getting used to it. One of the problems, of course, is the minute you have more than one guideline, then the different guidelines might give slightly different messages. And one of the early guidelines set forward that one of the purposes of sentence was to express society's disapproval of the behaviour. And I think this might be the very area in which the public feel that perhaps the sentence hasn't got it entirely right.
And the judges also have to take into account the deterrent effect as well of the message that a sentence sends.
They can take it into account, and I suppose equally you might think it's not so much of a deterrent to 270 hours as opposed to 3 or 4 years in the jail. So equally, I think if there was to be a Crown appeal, then it might focus on the fact that it doesn't have the appropriate deterrent effect and it doesn't express society's disapproval of raping 13-year-olds.
Well, we're grateful for your time and your insight this morning. Leading criminal defence lawyer Thomas Ross, KC. The Crown Office has said that, as with all cases, the Crown will consider the sentence and give consideration to whether it might be unduly lenient.
Time now is 6 minutes to 8.